It's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello. The inaugural Town Hall for Congress Club this past Sunday was amazing. It was great to see so many people fired up.
Yeah, it was a big success. I want to thank everybody who showed up and had great questions, and we'll get to some of the questions that we couldn't get to either in the radio program or in the next town hall meeting, but I think it went off without a hitch. And I want to thank our associate producer, Hannah Feldman, for being the producer behind that. So I hope you enjoyed that too. Ralph, the man of the hour, Ralph Nader is here.
Very
Hello,
much so. Yeah, very much so. Well, we learned a lot of things, and it's a lot of work to do to get the people to recover Congress, which is the most important instrument constitutionally to turn the country around. So it was a good start.
Very good start. But on today's program, we'll be joined by Harvard Law professor Randall Kennedy to discuss his new book, Say It Loud, on Race, Law, History, and Culture. Through more than 24 essays, Professor Kennedy debates dememorializing Woodrow Wilson at Princeton University, shines a light on how Black students fought for and won protection of their constitutional rights on campuses, examines the value of, quote, cussing out white liberals, end quote, and so much more. We'll ask him about his book and how the realities and imaginaries of race interact with the law in America. As always, we'll check in with our resolute corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's hear from Randall Kennedy about the paradox, irony, and messiness of social relations in American life. David?
Randall Kennedy is the Michael R. Klein Professor at Harvard Law School and the author of Say It Loud, on Race, Law, History, and Culture. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor Randall Kennedy.
Thanks so much.
Welcome, Randall. Appreciate very much your coming on. Your book is a compilation of essays, some of them in prior publications, some of them new. It's called Say It Loud, on Race, Law, History, and Culture. What do you prefer to start this conversation with by saying it loud?
Well, I think that the most important essay in the book is the first essay. The first essay is a piece about optimism and pessimism in racial thinking in America. And I think much of the book stems from that essay.
I read the whole book, obviously, and I was really shocked by your honesty, intellectual honesty and candor. And I want to share the last paragraph in the book with our readers. The page before you said, quote, at the outset of writing these comments, I felt embarrassed by the undeveloped state of my own imaginings, end quote. And then the last paragraph says, listeners, this is extremely candid. Very few people with all the years of thought and action of Professor Randall Kennedy, very few people would say this. I'm quoting you. Maybe it is prudent to forswear strict allegiance to any grand blueprint that would seek to master our unruly racial reality. Maybe the best that can safely be managed are smaller, though significant interstitial goals that are attentive to the pluralism that infuses American practices. This states for racial prejudice alongside permission for racial prejudice, aversion to unjustifiable racial distinctions alongside accommodation of desires to identify in racial terms, or remedying racial wrongs along handling other tasks, yearning for racial promised lands alongside pragmatic acceptance of decent compromises, end quote. And I thought to myself, I think if we had a discussion on how corporatism feeds systemic racism, it might take it to a different level, Randall. And I've always been, for many decades, of the belief that the most dominant institution in our country that systematically plans almost everything in our country, that's what corporations do, are these large corporations, which have risen to such power that they have developed a mature corporate state, Washington and Wall Street. And you can see it in so many events, bailouts, handouts, giveaways. uncontrolled military budget, distortion of public budgets, and basically big corporations saying no to living wage, no to universal health insurance, no to fair tax systems, no to accessible and affordable education, no to tenant rights and the abolition of discriminatory investment known as redlining, no to dealing with environmental injustice, no to abolishing corporate prisons and a vested interest in having more prisoners, no to getting rid of these corporations' shaping of children's food habits, leading to obesity and diabetes, no to freeing people from the chattels of fine print contracts, and no to student having free tuition and higher education. And it just goes on and on. What do you think of entering here a major national dialogue on the corporate supremacy, where they're given equal rights under the Constitution, as I'm sure you've taught many students, with real human beings, but they have enormous capital, political, technological, media power that no billionaire could amass, and they have enormous immunities and impunities to engage in their ravages, which can be summarized in one phrase: the domination of civic values by commercial interests, something ancient religions warned their adherents about. So I want to have your thoughts here, because as a graduate of the law school that you teach, I'm stunned by the paucity of curricula, even now, not to mention in the 1950s, on the power of corporations and how they have integrated their supremacy in statutes, law, constitutional interpretations, etc. We never had a course on corporate crime when I was at the law school. Criminal law was all street crime, and tort law was driver-to-driver combat, never unsafe designed motor vehicles or highways. And antitrust was, in the background. And there was only one clinic. Now there are 32 clinics or so. So can you tell me, do you think that corporatism is a major precursor and applier of inbred racial attitudes into the actual practice of the way people are forced to live in this country?
Yes, with a big punctuation mark. I think that, what you just said is largely true. And let me elaborate a bit. We live in an immensely wealthy country, yet in this immensely wealthy country, we see millions who live in miserable circumstances. And they live in miserable circumstances that are avoidable. Think of the number of young people that are impoverished. Think of we have several millions of people who are either homeless or on the verge of homelessness. These are avoidable circumstances, and our political system does not address them. And a big part of why the political system does not address them is because we have various forces in American life, including commercial forces, the ones that you focused on, that prevent our political system from addressing urgent needs. So I agree with much of what you said. And when it comes to race, I mainly write about racial conflicts. One thing I would say is that in thinking about and in writing about racial conflicts, one of the things that racism has done throughout American history, it's been very effective as diversion, diverting people from looking at their circumstances and focusing on something else, focusing on these other people very often these other people of color and pointing a finger and saying, that's the problem over there. And of course, that's still happening. We've seen it. We see it, frankly, daily. And many of the problems that we face, we don't see these problems fully, in part because of race, racism, and even the way in which people who are opposed to racism actually frame their opposition to racism. So let's take something like policing. In the last few years, policing and police brutality, police misconduct, racist policing, that's been in the forefront, and that's good. It's good that there has been attention paid to bad policing and attention paid to the scandalous way in which the legal system declines to regulate the police. One problem, however, is, at least in my view, is that when we talk about bad policing, there's a way in which we focus actually overmuch on race. So when people talk about bad policing, when people talk about police brutality, when people talk about folks being needlessly killed by the police, there's a black face put on the discussion. People immediately think in racial terms. Now, in my view, race needs to be part of the discussion because people of color, particularly Black people, are disproportionately affected, adversely affected by bad policing. But, white people are affected by bad policing too. There are plenty of white people who are needlessly shot by the police every year. There are lots of white people who are being sent to prison for too long. There are lots of white people who are roughed up by the police, and that part of the discussion needs to be, that needs to be part of the discussion too. And in a variety of the areas that you touched upon, we need to recognize that these are not simply problems that are put upon racial minorities. These are problems that are put upon racial minorities and, lots of white people too. So that's the first thing that I have to say.
That's a very important point. And, in all of us trying to think of how to unify people against broad-gauged injustice that applies to everybody, what I call indiscriminate injustice, compared to discriminatory injustice. Corporations get a pass. They escape scrutiny. They begin to develop advertising, public relations, full-page ads, praising minorities or healthcare workers in COVID-19 pandemic. And you've always called out hypocrisy, and I want to put a couple on your desk here. We're talking with Professor Randall Kennedy of Harvard Law School, the author of the book, Say It Loud. Just recently, the Philadelphia Inquirer had a dust-up. Apparently, a writer was writing about how public demonstrations affect public buildings. And he used the phrase, public buildings matter. And there was an uproar by the staff and other groups in Philadelphia. And the editor resigned. He was editor for over 10 years and with the paper for over 20. And there was almost like a personal immolation. Now, we all know what the situation for Black people is in Philadelphia. And that is not one of the high priorities for a paper that's already faltering. And the other example is Governor Northam, who, when he was a medical student, participated in a play 30 years earlier where someone, he couldn't remember it was him or a fellow actor, wore blackface. And there were calls for his immediate resignation. This was 30 years ago as a medical student. And he resisted, and he began to advocate a lot of good things that Black groups in Virginia lauded him for. The other thing, you may have missed this, but I read the New York Times inserts, the fashion magazines. And over the years, you would have to turn a lot of pages. It is a very slick magazine, full of ads, to find a Black model. Now, at least 50% of the models in these inserts are Black and some Asian Americans. And someone would say, well, that's good. That creates a lot of work for Black models. But my reaction is, here's a newspaper that has neglected all kinds of brutal exploitation in the city itself. Its metropolitan page on Sunday is a farce. It's thin, and it doesn't really tell you what's going on in New York City, what the developers are doing, what the payday loan racketeers are doing, what the areas of food deserts are doing, what the lack of adequate health care, the lack of adequate police protection in poor areas, for example, the discriminatory distribution of firehouses. It's even reached that area where the better off places have more firehouses, and on and on and on. And so I'm saying, what's the New York Times doing? They got this slick insert, a magazine, maybe 100 pages, selling clothing and other accessories that no one but the top 1 or 2% could even afford. I mean, there's staggering prices, including the jewelry. And yet, I'm sure some people in the minority community say, well, this is good. The Times is finally gotten over the impression that there are no other models but white models. But how do you react to this, all this, Randall? I mean, it's just so diversionary. When I was a law student at Harvard, I couldn't stand the place. I had to go to South Boston to see how the law was being used as an instrument of oppression. How do you deal with this? Because it affects the students as well. They go wild over ethnic, racial, and gender slurs. They don't quite go as wild over the conditions on the ground in the country which represent those baleful words. How do you deal with all this?
Couple things. First, it's a good thing that people's antenna are up and that people are demanding social justice, including, of course, racial justice. It's good that people are, on guard and are invested. That's good. What's a problem, however, and this is behind your question, some of the exuberance that is, so much in evidence, some of it is, I think, mistaken and leading in directions that need to be rethought. So, for instance, on language, I've seen this too. I've seen situations in which a leader of, let's say, a college, there was a college here in Massachusetts a couple of years ago, there was a big rally, and it was a rally in favor of Black Lives Matter, and the rally was intended to support Black Lives Matter. It was intended to focus attention and increase attention on the problem of police misconduct. And the leader of the college, white lady, comes out and she's speaking and she says, she's being supportive of Black Lives Matter. And then she makes a comment that went something like, Black Lives Matter, of course, Black Lives Matter, because all lives matter. And when she says all lives matter, people in the crowd start booing her. They start booing her. They go after her for a couple of days. Then, she apologizes. Her apology doesn't quiet things down. People just continued to go after her. And I was reading about this. I'm listening to this on the radio. And I didn't like that. I mean, it was obvious that this was a person who was on the side of Black Lives Matter. This was a person who was on the side of disciplining bad policing. And so she makes a statement, all lives matter, and people, sort of go berserk. Well, why? The fact of the matter is, that's right, all lives matter, and that's precisely why Black Lives Matter. So when people sort of fasten on to, certain sort of, fashionable slogans and sort of fasten on those, losing the forest for the trees, I think that's a bad thing. I'll tell you something. There's students who've gotten very angry at me over the years because sometimes I refer to myself as Black. I refer to myself as African American. I also refer to myself, by the way, as Negro from time to time, colored from time to time. And I've had students who've gotten really angry with me, especially when I use the word Negro. And I tell them, you know, I started using the word Negro. I know exactly when I started doing it. I started using the word Negro very consistently in 1983, 1984. Why? Because my boss demanded that I use the word Negro, capital N. Who was my boss? My boss was Justice Thurgood Marshall, Mr. Civil Rights. I clerked for him the 1983-84 Supreme Court term. He used the word Negro. There's nothing wrong with the word Negro. Martin Luther King used the word Negro. W.B. Du Bois used the word Negro. Bayard Rustin used the word Negro. Rosa Parks used the word Negro. Fannie Lou Hamer used the word Negro. If it was good enough for them, it's good enough for me. Cut out, you know, the sort of the obsession with linguistic fashion, and let's get down to brass tacks.
Well put. And that leads to my next topic, which is the need to focus on class and corporatism, which exploits everybody. Climate disruption harms everybody, some people more than others, obviously, but harms everybody. Fine print contracts, which you have taught many years at Harvard Law School, that affects everybody, but affects some people who have to go for payday loans more voraciously. You've got bailouts, which are a detriment to all taxpayers. They bail out Wall Street, but these corporations, I don't see them supporting restitution for Black people and the legacy of slavery. One could go many, many examples, but I just think a justice movement in America is much stronger if it unites people. 65 million poor whites get ripped off in all states, red states, blue states, just like tens of millions of Black people and Hispanics. These kinds of issues, of class issues, they not only throw people into fighting against one another for the scraps at lower income levels, but they entail a tremendous amount of diversion, as you say, because if you just stay in the racial injustice area, you're going to divide people. Bad words will be used, abolition type demands on the police will be used, the politicians will take advantage of it. I understand that alone hurt the Democrats in 2020, the phrase abolish the police or defund the police, which I don't know a single Democratic candidate who said that. It was said by street protesters, by the way. So I'm very troubled by the young generation. I think they are very sensitive to words, politically correct, as you pointed out in your book, examples. I think they're very insensitive to their responsibilities to address deeds. For example, they might not like discriminatory policies against low-income students and the commercial universities that exploit them, but there's never been a mass movement to get rid of student loans and be like Western Europe, where you have tuition-free education. The same is with the military-industrial complex and wars of empire that drain public budgets from responding to the necessities of all the people in our country, public works, infrastructure, $7 trillion on Afghanistan and Iraq, blowing them up. I'm very worried about this, and I say this from a long history, Randall, some of which you may not be aware of, and some you are. But when I was studying contracts and property at Harvard, West Publishing Company never had a single case, even though they started us from medieval England into the early years of our republic and slavery. They never had a single case on slavery. And of course, that was highly litigated between slave owners contractually and in terms of property. We had 15 women out of 525 in the class. I went to Dean Griswold and said, "What's going on here?" He said, "Well, look, you got to understand that seats at Harvard Law School are valuable, and a lot of people at this school think that women are going to get married, have babies, and they're not going to practice law." Can you imagine that playing today? He was good on civil liberties, and he challenged McCarthy. but it was a very sexist place. There's one Black American in my class, and I wrote a long piece for the Harvard Law Record rebutting a psychologist who was on the cover of U.S. News and World Report, which is a big magazine then, saying that Negroes are genetically inferior to whites. And so I just dropped my courses and said, what's going on here? Nobody was troubled by that. And so I got Ashley Montague, after hundreds of calls, to write a rebuttal in the Harvard Law Record. And I distributed it in Langdale Hall and everywhere. And it was all free, obviously, at Harkness Commons. And none of the students thought anything was wrong. They looked at me and said, what are you wasting your time for? What's all this about? It's come a long way.
It has.
The law schools have come a long way. But we have a new twist on this young generation. They go nuts over language, but they're not rolling up their sleeves and using their power on changing conditions on the ground.
I think that we do need a much more class-inflected racial progressivism. I really do. I think that there are a number of issues where we really need to rethink and be willing to go back to the drawing board. And we need to be careful about the allocation of our resources. I'll give you one, and I think it might be, controversial with your audience. It might be controversial with people, but I'll put it on the table. I have been a supporter of racial affirmative action. One of my books a few years ago was called For Discrimination, and it was an argument in favor of racial affirmative action. But one thing I said then, and I'll say it now, and I'll underline it now. If we're talking about affirmative action at colleges, if we're talking about affirmative action at professional schools, we should realize that we are talking about the distribution and the redistribution of opportunity among people who are already relatively privileged. I mean, if you are a plausible candidate for admission to, let's say, the University of Michigan Law School, you're doing pretty well. I mean, that means that you are a college graduate, and it means that you have a pretty strong record if you were a plausible candidate for admission to the University of Michigan Law School. Now, I want there to be some attention paid to that sector of American society and Black American society. At the same time, what about those kids who are not getting a high school diploma, or who are getting a high school diploma and are still functionally illiterate? I mean, in my circles, in many of the circles that I've been hanging around with, a lot more attention has been paid to the who gets into the University of Michigan Law School, or who gets into that, for that matter, Harvard Law School, as opposed to the kids who are facing lifetime unemployment or lifetime employment under rather terrible circumstances. So, I think
more massive numbers too.
Probably we need to, think about, well, who is really in most need? How should we allocate and reallocate our sources?
There's one part of your book, Professor Kennedy, that provokes a personal experience I had when I was lobbying against Clarence Thomas's nomination in the Senate and going into one Senate office after another. And I thought we were making ground because Senator George Mitchell was a majority leader, and Thomas was confirmed 52-48 with, I think, 11 or 12 Democrats crossing the aisle and making his nomination possible for replacing the great Thurgood Marshall. And you have a chapter in your book, Say It Loud, which is titled, Why Clarence Thomas Ought to Be Ostracized. And just in the New York Times, there was an op-ed saying, this is now Clarence Thomas's Supreme Court. So he's no longer just a lone or dissenter. Could you tell our listeners why you are critical of Clarence Thomas?
Well, I'm critical because we have a reactionary Supreme Court. Note my word, I didn't just say a conservative Supreme Court. We have a reactionary Supreme Court, and he is the most reactionary member of that reactionary court. There are a couple things to be said about Clarence Thomas. I think it's this coming weekend will mark his 30th year on the Supreme Court. And it's a very sobering, it's a very sad tale. It is really quite a bad mark against the Senate of the United States, a Senate that was at that time in Democratic hands, that allowed Clarence Thomas to become a justice. The fact of the matter is, we knew enough about Justice Thomas then to have anticipated that he would be awful. And his record has been awful. If you take a look at the question of women's rights, reproductive rights, racial justice, he has been on the right side of the court. His worst vote, in my view, was in the case involving the Voting Rights Act, Shelby County versus Holder, in which the Voting Rights Act was eviscerated. It was a 5-4 decision. Justice Thomas was part of the 5. Here was the most effective piece of legislation from the Second Reconstruction, a piece of legislation that, was it radical? No, not really. It was simply intended to allow people to vote. And he cast a vote eviscerating that. So it was for those reasons that in my view, Justice Thomas should be ostracized. Yeah, that's right. People should understand that his votes really do have an effect, an adverse effect on America, on real people. And to go back to an earlier point that you were making, we have to realize, our country right now, as we speak, our country is in peril. Our country is in real peril. And so many of the bad things, the bad policies that have issued forth at the state level, the federal level, they're coming back and they are haunting us. I mean, if you just think about, look what's going on with respect to voting. In the last election, there was a real fear as to whether there would be a peaceful handover of power. And of course, it wasn't really altogether peaceful. January 6th happened. And you're talking about impunity. Well, look at that. There was an attempted insurrection. Some of the, sort of little people are being prosecuted. But to go on with your point about impunity, are the bigger fish going to pay the cost? Are the bigger fish going to be held to account? The answer is probably, and very unfortunately, sadly, disgracefully, the answer is no. Our country is in peril, and frankly, Justice Thomas is part of the forces that are imperiling our democracy. So for that reason, in my view, Justice Thomas, yes, ought to be ostracized. Not alone. I mean, he's not alone. If it was just him, you wouldn't have the Supreme Court actually coming up with the rulings that it's coming up with. But he is an important figure. You mentioned the New York Times article. That's right. This is Justice Thomas's court that we are facing. And what does that mean for consumers? That means that consumers are going to get the short end of the stick. What does that mean for organized labor? It means that organized labor is facing a unfriendly court. What does that mean for racial minorities? It means that racial minorities are facing a court that is really quite unsympathetic to them. And Justice Thomas is a very powerful figure in the American judiciary. And, that's what we have. That's what we're going to be facing for the foreseeable future. And that's why we need for people to be more engaged, and we need for people to be willing to rethink how we face the perils that menace us.
Before we conclude, I want to get Steve and David in on this.
Yes, Professor Kennedy, I want to circle back to something you said at the very beginning about what you thought was the most important essay in the book. It's entitled, Shall We Overcome Optimism and Pessimism in African American Thought? And in that essay, you say, and I'm quoting, I have long been a racial optimist, even though my father, whom I revere, was a racial pessimist through and through, unquote. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So in racial thinking among Black folk, there are two big camps over the centuries. There's the camp of folks who think we shall overcome. It'll be possible to create a democratic, multiracial society in which people are neighborly and view one another as equals. That's the optimistic camp. And in that camp are some, wonderful folks. In the 19th century, the great spokesperson for that camp would have been the great Frederick Douglass. In the 20th century, it would have been Martin Luther King Jr. In the 21st century, probably the most consequential person would be Barack Obama. And I've situated myself for most of my life in that optimistic camp. Now, there is a pessimistic camp, and that's the camp my father was in. The pessimistic camp said, no, we shall not overcome. And there's very interesting thinkers in the pessimistic camp, including white people. I mean, Alexis de Tocqueville was in the pessimistic camp. So was Thomas Jefferson. So was Abraham Lincoln. These were the people who said, you know what, given American history, we're not going to be able to overcome. In the Black nationalist tradition, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad, those would be people who were pessimists. My father was a thoroughgoing pessimist. He thought that America had betrayed Black people, and he never forgave America for that. Now, I remain an optimist, but I have to say that my faith has been profoundly shaken. Why has it been shaken? The thing that has shaken it the most in the past few years is the ascension of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States. I mean, here was a person who obviously trafficked in racial resentment, in racial animus, in racial bigotry. Yet he won the White House. And not only did he win the White House, but, when he got over 70 million votes in the last election. And so my faith has been shaken, though I still, on balance, put myself in the optimistic camp, probably a little bit out of longing. I mean, after all, I've got three 20-year-old children in their 20s. So I'm hopeful for them, but we are at a sobering moment.
Well, when I was a law student, we'd go to Harvard Square and contemplate the tormented world in a cafeteria. And I remember one of my classmates said, look, nothing's going to change until Black people get power in legislatures and courts. Fast forward, there were 48 Black members of Congress, and they're part of the Congressional Black Caucus and its associated organizations, heavily funded by almost every corporate interest you can imagine, the oil companies, the soft drink companies, the drug companies. And some years ago, Randall, I went to them, and they were chairs of committees. They weren't just backbenchers. And I said, there's a great need for public hearings on what's going on in the inner cities. because it's off the radar. It's not being reported, especially on nighttime network television. And I couldn't get any resonance, whether judiciary, whether Ways and Means, you name it. I finally got a non-legislative subcommittee chair to hold 2 days of hearings, Dennis Kucinich from Ohio.
I think, again, our country, especially on the racial front, we are still in a rather primitive state. We're coming from such a low level. And it's still the case that folks have been beaten down so much that they're really happy when they see a Black face in a position of authority. And so much so that, there are a lot of people who they're really quite satisfied with that and that alone. Now, there is a way in which that alone is an advance, okay? The fact that Tim Scott is a Black man representing South Carolina in the Senate of the United States, does that represent in some way an advance? Yes, it does. Now, at the same time, you take a look at the policies that Tim Scott embraces, and, unfortunately, many of them are awful. And so I think what we're going to have to start doing more and more and more is demanding more than just the appearance, more than just the Black face, the brown face, on and on. What is your thinking? What are your policies? And now here I'm speaking directly to white progressive folk. We're going to have to stop being mau-maued. I remember soon after Barack Obama was voted into the presidency, very early in his administration, you, Ralph Nader, criticized Obama. You criticized him. You say, he's not being tough enough on the banks. He's not looking out enough for the people who are really being hurt by this recession and by what's going on with the housing market, et cetera. And I listened on a number of occasions to people who really mau-maud you. And basically, they were, on a couple of occasions, Black commentators who basically said, hey, you white man, you've got to shut up. You've got to shut up. We've got a Black president. All we want you to do is applaud. And, we've got to get out of that. People have to be progressive, pay attention to the policy, pay attention to the facts, and be willing to, frankly, stand down folks who are going to mau and act as if it's a Black person, if it's a Black Democrat, that's all you need to have. No, that's not all you need to have. You need to ask, what are your policies? Who do those policies help? Who do those policies hurt? And let's just, again, get to brass tacks. Let's cut out the obsession with appearance and let's get into the substance of public policy. That is what should matter.
And that's why the message of Professor Randall Kennedy's book is so crucial today in an era of self-censorship, in an area of political repression, in an area of political correctness. Say it loud on race, law, history, and culture. And he's not just being a contrarian. Don't misjudge it on that basis. These are very reasoned articles that, if anything, express almost total absence of self-censorship, which we are all prone to exhibit from time to time. David?
Thank you, Ralph. Professor Kennedy, I'd like to ask you about the virtue of making people uncomfortable and zero tolerance. Earlier, you talked about this white woman who said all lives matter. And What's wrong with making her feel incredibly uncomfortable for saying all lives matter? What's wrong with zero tolerance for dog whistles? We all know that all lives matter is coded language, like states' rights. Shouldn't somebody who claims to be an ally be held accountable for not knowing that all lives matter is coded language? It's dog whistle, and it belies the fact that you're not an ally. If you say something like that, you're not paying close enough attention to us.
I think that there are such things as dog whistles. That's right. There are people who chant all lives matter to put down Black Lives Matter. And when people are doing that, I'm against it. The scenario that I portrayed was not a case, however, in which somebody was engaging in dog whistling. What we had was a person who was clearly on the side of the people, the reformers, the people who were trying to challenge racist policing. Now, maybe you could say, let's suppose that she was not being careful enough. Let's suppose that. Let's even suppose that you could say, well, she was being negligent with her speech. Let's suppose that. I would still say, listen, she's obviously trying to lend her support to a progressive campaign. For goodness sakes, don't stone her. Don't, she is an ally, or at least a potential ally.
Right. But if there's room for her, there has to be room for people who have zero tolerance for her. Don't you think that the movement has to have a segment that says, why are you speaking before us if you don't know that all lives matter is a horrible thing to say? We need we're going to be tolerant of her. We should be tolerant of people who don't put up with that nonsense.
Well, I would say to the people who don't, who say that they don't want to put up with the nonsense, I would take them aside and say, listen, what is it, after all, that we're trying to accomplish here? Are we trying to, are we engaged in a setup where we're, sort of giving grades to people in how they, perform? Or are we trying to create a movement in which we bring people over to our side? Now, I'm engaged. I hope other people, I thought that the protesters were engaged in trying to bring as many people over to their side as possible so that we can move the needle with respect to policing policy and regulating the police. That's what you're doing. If that's what you're doing, you want to avoid alienating or hurting people who can be brought over to your side.
Zero tolerance can reach a state of censorship and suppression and violation of the First Amendment. I once had a law professor who was an absolutist in reverse. He was absolutely protecting all kinds of speech. He hardly recognized defamation. But in chapter 14 of Professor Kennedy's book, he discusses the N-word, and he discusses it in ways that allow free speech. Could you elaborate on that, Professor Kennedy?
Well, yeah. In the law school world, in the last few years, you've had a peculiar thing happen. You've had people who have been giving talks, let's say about a Supreme Court case. Sometimes it's a First Amendment case, sometimes it's a case involving a murder, but all sorts of cases. And the infamous N-word will appear in the case. It was an important part of the case. And the teacher will, sometimes people have read from a court case or read from a deposition or some sort of document and use the word. That is to say, repeated the word out loud. And students have gotten really angry and have said, you can't say the word. And by the way, it's almost always a white teacher to whom the students react in this way. And there are a number of teachers who have been disciplined. One teacher, I mean, there have been a couple of teachers who've been fired under these circumstances. And what I've said is, listen, we're in school. It's not as if these teachers are using the word in the way in which, racists have used this word, over the centuries. That's not what's going on here. These teachers are using the word in a classroom for pedagogical purposes. Under these circumstances, in my view, it's ridiculous to claim that these teachers are being racist. It's ridiculous to punish these teachers. It's ridiculous to have a rule that says, under no circumstances can anybody ever articulate this word out loud. If that was the rule, one of my books, the title of one of my books, could not be mentioned in a classroom. In any event, that's one of my essays, and I stand by it. And I want to go back to the earlier point about zero tolerance. I think that these issues with which we are grappling are difficult issues, and people are going to see things differently. I have friends, for instance, whom I deeply respect, who view things differently with respect to the infamous N-word. They view, they think I'm wrong. Okay, that doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to talk. That doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to debate. So I think that we're going to have to be open to talking, even in the grip of disagreement. And to that extent, I think we have to be very careful about things like, zero tolerance. I mean, I think that for me, for instance, am I going to have a zero tolerance policy with people who disagree with me with respect to what I was saying about Black Lives Matter? No, I'm not going to have a zero tolerance. I'm not going to have a zero tolerance, position with you. You're taking the position, well, don't we need a bit of mowing? I don't think so, but you think so. And we have to talk. We have to be willing to talk about that.
Professor, doesn't zero tolerance in corporate America, where you're forbidden from speaking a certain way in corporate America, else you'll be fired. You'll be fired. That's zero tolerance. Laws are zero tolerance. That changes behavior. When you're not allowed to talk a certain way, it changes the way you think because people cower under the weight of the law.
Yes, and some shaming is good. Some ostracism is good.
If I had a corporation, and one of my employees said all lives matter in front of a group of African Americans, I would expect that person to be reported to human resources and say, we don't say that here. That's the law here at my corporation. If you don't like it, go find work someplace else. I think that's good.
No, well, I disagree with you then. I mean.
No, you're bordering on censorship, David. You really have to think through this because you're just strengthening the adversary. When you shove stuff underground, you get the kind of white rebellion that elects Trump because they're afraid to say anything. They're afraid to express their opinion. It's the seeds of a vicious response by people who have been shut up. It doesn't work, David. So anyway, we're out of time. Thank you very much. We've been speaking with Professor Randall Kennedy, who's just out with a book called Say It Loud on Race, Law, History, and Culture, published by Pantheon. And it's been widely reviewed, and I suspect in some respects superficially reviewed. And thank you for taking this discussion to a new level, Randall. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Be well.
We've been speaking with Professor Randall Kennedy. We will link to his collection of essays, Say It Loud, at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Let's take a quick break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, October 22, 2021. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Mark Faulkner, a former chief technical pilot for Boeing, pled not guilty to criminal charges of deceiving the Federal Aviation Administration in connection with the FAA's evaluation of the Boeing 737 MAX airplane. Earlier this year, the Justice Department deferred a prosecution against Boeing in connection with the crash of two Boeing 737 MAX airliners that killed 346 people. This tragedy deserves a search for truth, not a search for a scapegoat, said Faulkner's attorney David Gerger. If the government takes this case to trial, the truth will show that Mark did not cause this tragedy, he did not lie, and he should not be charged. Let me end with this plea, he said. To those of you who know the truth, you may have worked at Boeing or the FAA or an airline. Now is the time to help the truth come out. Please contact us. Get us a message. Do not be intimidated. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. And that's our show. We hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank our guest again, Randall Kennedy. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to drop off now, but for you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap Up. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Please subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph Nader's weekly column, you can get it for free by going to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
For a copy of the day the Rats Vetoed Congress, go to ratsreformcongress.org and also check out the Ralph Nader and Family Cookbook, Classic Recipes from Lebanon and Beyond. We'll link to both of those at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our associate producer is Hannah Feldman. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody, and listeners. How about a little praise for all the volunteers on this show? Nobody gets paid. We don't ask you for funds. It's a great service. Give them some feedback.
Hey, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the Wrap-Up, where Ralph continues his conversation with Randall Kennedy about the role of law schools in fighting the good fight.
Now, just one quick thing. You mentioned my workplace, Harvard Law School. I've been there since 1984. I'm going to tell you, the Harvard Law School that you went to is very different than the Harvard Law School that exists today. I teach contracts. We spend a lot of time on the pathologies of contracting. You mentioned form contracts and contracts of adhesion. One of the leading commentators that has shed a light on that problem is one of my colleagues, Professor Rakoff, Todd Rakoff. All of us who teach contracts, or certainly most of us who teach contracts, talk about the coerciveness of contracting. So, you talk about with respect to torts, with respect to antitrust, with respect to criminal law, there has been much more attentiveness paid to those social pathologies. And while I'm at it, let me just say one quick thing, Mr. Ralph Nader. One reason for that is your example. The fact of the matter is you've had a long career, you've touched upon a lot of different areas of American law, and there are people who, actually push ideas that you helped push way back when. They might not even refer to you, frankly. You've been around a long time. There are people who are pushing some of your ideas, and they don't know that you were pushing those ideas. But you have been successful in actually changing American academic legal culture. Not enough by any means. No, by no means not enough, but, to a substantial extent.
Well, that gets us to the issue of lawlessness. I wrote a column once called "There Should Be Two Curriculums at Harvard Law School: the regular commercial practice of law and the courses that shape students' understanding, and the rampant entrenched lawlessness, all the way from the criminal and justice system to Wall Street and Washington, like Trump, a racist, clearly above the law. There's no indication that Merrick Garland of the Attorney General is going to ask for a special counsel for all the serial criminal violations, the Hatch Act, the Anti-Deficiency Act, on, that Trump was brazenly and openly culpable. I mean, he didn't try to hide it like Nixon and Watergate. And we're really quite astonished. With few luminous exceptions, the 200 and some law schools are pretty quiet about rampant entrenched lawlessness, especially in the area of the war powers and Congress's self-reduction of status under the Constitution. And we're not getting any resonance in Washington. We need help. We're trying to get support, and the bar associations are asleep at the switch. We've written to the American Bar Association and say, you know, in 2005, Mr. Greco, who was head of the American Bar Association, a corporate lawyer from Boston, got together 3 task forces of former lawyers under both administrations in Washington and put out 3 reports saying that George W. Bush was engaging in unconstitutional practices. But there were 3 white papers. They're on the ABA website. And now the ABA is doing nothing. It's like the legal profession, which should be the sentinels, the early warning signalers of rampant lawlessness right down to where people live, work, and raise their families, but also at the higher levels of corporate power and government power. This should be the major priority, and they're just not interested. They don't even know how to define the phrase officer of the court anymore. And it's just there are always a few law professors who are in the forefront, thank goodness. But generally speaking, where are the deans? Where are the bar associations? A lot of lawyers in Congress are looking the other way. They're members of Congress. I invite your comments here.
Yes and no. Yes, we do very unfortunately live in a society in which, at least currently, terrible things are done with impunity. From the policing, you know, it's a rarity when a police officer who has wrongly hurt someone is called to account. I mean, it's headline news, and it's headline news because it's so rare. But let's go up the ladder. You're absolutely right when you talk about the impunity. I mean, that, in my view, the action that grabbed me by the throat the most was the separation of parents from their children at the border. I mean, that was absolutely a moral crime, and not enough has been said about it. Not enough has been done about it. It was done, and, you know, we have a problem of widespread impunity. No, Donald Trump will probably never be called to account for the terrible things that he did, because frankly, if you're big enough in the United States, you get a pass, even for egregious misconduct. And we obviously need to work on that. I will say this, there have been times in the past few years when I did feel some pride amongst the ranks of lawyers. So early, for instance, in the Trump years, when the curtains came down with him at the borders, at the airports, and you had these scenes where you had lawyers going to the airports and holding up signs saying, you know, I'm a lawyer, and volunteering their services. That was a wonderful moment. There should be more moments like that. I would totally agree with you. And, you know, and we're going to have to work on that. We're going to have to work on elevating the ethos of the ethos of public concern amongst lawyers, and we're going to have to work on elevating the ethos of public concern, in the citizenry as a whole. That's my response to your comment on that.
Well, apropos your point on if you're big and powerful, you'd like to get immune, that's shared by like 98% of the American people. I mean, they got away with it is a vernacular. And Wall Street is getting away with it like never before. In the savings and loan scandals 30 years ago, 800 officials, executives were prosecuted and sent to jail. In 2008, nobody was prosecuted and sent to jail. The same is true with lawless people in government. I mean, Mike Pompeo, a graduate of our law school, he's done things and made statements that are absolutely violating international law, constitutional law, statutory law. I mean, we have a government that's killing people all over the world. They killed over 1 million people in Iraq and destroyed that country, and Afghanistan, no declaration of war. Libya was toppled, and the chaos is spreading into other African countries after Hillary Clinton persuaded Barack Obama to topple Gaddafi. There was no authorization of funding, no appropriation of funding, no declaration of war. They just took it out of the black budget of the Defense Department, even though the Secretary of Defense, Barbara Gates, was against Hillary Clinton trying to destabilize Libya when Gaddafi was cutting deals again with Western countries and disarming his weapons. The rampant laws, I would think the law schools would be awake to that. And I just don't see that. International law is almost like a dead letter. Contract law is, as you know better than anybody, is cannibalizing tort law now, waivers of liability and
arbitration,
right of trial. Yeah, unilateral changes of contracts. Oh, you agreed to it. In page 8, the contract of Airbnb with homeowners is 165 pages long, just the agreement they have to sign. So we've lost our freedom of contract for most of our transactions. We're now losing access to tort law and the right of trial by jury. I mean, there's a massive empirical crisis going on in this so-called rule of law country, and the law school should be afire with this. They were in the civil rights times, and they made a great contribution. We just interviewed a law professor from Yale who basically said law schools don't have that much influence. I mean, they're just educational institutions. He said I was exaggerating the impact of law schools. Law schools can be the leaders. Professors, deans could be the leaders. And this is basically what legal education should be about. Law doesn't mean anything if it doesn't equate with justice. Am I exaggerating?
No, I think that I would say this. I'm all with you on your aspiration. I do think that there is more effort being put on this, the problems in our society. There is more light being put on those problems than I think that you're giving credit for. I mean, again, I think if you go to the law schools, there is an effort being put forward to examine, to investigate, to set forth, what about model legislation? How would you do it differently? There are people who really are working at that. They're just up against it. And what they're up against is, the establishment. And the establishment, they're smart. They're smart. They get very smart people. And like you said at the very outset of our discussion, they're very good at public relations. They're very good at, if you say that there is a racial problem, they will respond by putting in various faces of color and saying, okay, that ends the problem. That's right. We've got people of color in here now. Has there been any change in policy? Well, maybe not. The people of color may be doing perfectly terrible things, but they're very good at diverting. They're very good at cosmetics. And we're up against a lot, as you well know. And we're just going to have to continue to fight the good fight. But in fighting the good fight, we're also going to have to, be re-examining our own thinking all the time, our own tactics, to get back to the point about the big tent. We need to have a big tent. You're going to have a big tent to change things. You're not going to be able to change things in this huge country of ours by having just, a couple 100,000 people in the street saying that they're woke. Maybe they are woke. Great, good for them. But you're not going to, things are not going to change with a couple of 100,000. Things are not going to change with, a couple of demonstrations, even if they are glorious demonstrations. You're going to have millions of people behind you to change things. Not only are you going to have millions of people behind you, but you are going to have organizations like labor unions behind you, people and organizations who can be there season after season after season. And that's what we don't have. And that's what we're going to have to build to have.
Very well said. We really need to build new civic institutions too and strengthen existing ones, because we're not keeping up with the concentration of power in fewer hands, represented by corporate law firms who broker these strategies and tactics. So that's extremely important. I think law schools can develop facilities allowing people to band together, not just labor union reform and repealing Taft-Hartley, but banding together as insurance policyholders, bank customers, banding together as utility ratepayers. In Georgia, the U.S. government has funded never finished construction nuclear plants, $13 billion they poured in. And would they pour in $13 billion into Georgia's public services? Hardly.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we speak with Miranda Massey about her work founding the Climate Museum and Christopher Shaw about his work examining the corporate threat to the post office. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too